we each were on 9/11. But I want to start in 1997, which is when we worked at the same unit in CNN, and we actually worked at the same unit at ABC News. Peter, we met in 1984 when Peter started there. And we were actually working for our old ABC News boss at CNN. And Peter basically figured out before anybody else that there was this guy named Osama Bin Laden, and the West needed to pay attention to him. And our boss gave him a green light, and Peter took a team to Afghanistan, where they did the first ever TV interview with Osama Bin Laden in a cave in Afghanistan. And in that interview, Bin Laden declared holy war, jihad, against the U.S. So, Peter, just describe briefly how you heard about Bin Laden and how you got that interview.
Well, thank you, David, and thank you to the Rotary Club for this kind invitation. I was living in New York, like David, in the early 90s. In February 26, 1993, the Trade Center is blown. There was an attempt to bring down the Trade Center by a guy called Ramzi Youssef. He drives a van, his team drive a van into the basement, blow up the van. They wanted to bring down both towers. They killed 6 people. And I started looking into this, and I found out that most of the people involved in that plot had either served in Afghanistan with the Mujahideen or were supporting the Afghan war in some shape or form. So I went to Afghanistan for the first time in '93, and we started investigating this phenomenon. And I went with Peter Arnett, who at the time was, of course, working for CNN, the world's most famous foreign correspondent at that time, certainly. And we spent several weeks in Afghanistan digging into this. And then in '96, the State Department released a statement about Bin Laden. And I thought, well, the people who bombed the Trade Center the first time were pretty organized, and they had training. And organizations have leaders, and maybe Bin Laden was the leader of this attack. So that's when I went to our boss at CNN again and said, she'd never heard of Osama Bin Laden. And I said, I think he might be responsible for this Trade Center attack. She said, fine. And at that time, of course, Afghanistan was controlled by the Taliban, and we went there. I spent a lot of time in London with 2 of Bin Laden's sort of associates, and they were very concerned about, are you a CIA agent? They'd never done they had no dealings with the media. They had no idea how the media works. After considerable negotiation, they said, fine. We went to Pakistan, went over the Khyber Pass into Taliban-controlled Afghanistan, checked into a 0-star hotel in eastern Afghanistan, and waited around for some period of time. And out of one day, you told me. Unfortunately, I don't want to take up all the time on this story.
Go ahead.
Okay, all right.
I think it's mildly interesting.
Okay. So they, a heavily armed a van with a bunch of heavily armed guys came to the hotel. Bin Laden's media advisor had come earlier. He said, basically, do not bring any of your gear with you. We had like $50,000 of gear. Leave it all behind. Don't bring a watch. Just bring the clothes that you're going to wear. They were very concerned about a tracking device. In fact, very interestingly, they mentioned Terry Waite, who was a British hostage taken in Lebanon, who may have been taken because of this issue in part. But so they were pretty highly educated, and they said, we are very concerned about a tracking device. And then the van came, heavily armed men. We got in the van. We drove through the night, change of vehicle, blindfolds. Everybody's heavily armed, rocket-propelled grenades, AK-47s. They run some sort of device over us to supposedly pick up a tracking device. And we get to this mud hut, and we wait, and we serve some meat of some description, and we wait. And then out of the darkness appears Osama Bin Laden, and everybody in this room knows a lot about him. I didn't even know really. We didn't really know what he was going to look like. And he sat. He's very tall, he's 6'4", very thin, rail thin. He spoke very softly. His words were full of anger against the United States, but the way he comported himself was like a cleric. He was very soft-spoken. his tone of voice was like he was reading the phone book, but he was, declaring war against the United States. It was no cultural criticism of the United States. It was a foreign policy critique of our support for Israel, our support for Saudi Arabia, Egypt, etc. He delivered this diatribe and then he left. And I thought, well, that's all very interesting, but how do you attack the United States from a place 6,000 miles away, which has been taken back into the Middle Ages by the Taliban? And the answer came about a year later when they blew up 2 US embassies within 9 minutes of each other, killing 212 people, 12 Americans, 200 Kenyans and Tanzanians. And that made it clear that these guys could operate from Afghanistan, could reach out thousands of miles, had no compunction about killing many civilians. It's hard for us to remember, but there's Brian Jenkins, who kind of invented the field of terrorism studies in the United States, famously said in the 1970s, you want a lot of people watching and not a lot of people dying. Because basically, if you have too many people dying, you're going to turn off any popular support. So Bin Laden changed that. He wanted a lot of people watching. 9/11 was the most watched event in world history, and a lot of people dying. And with the embassy attacks, you could see Kenya and Tanzania have substantial Muslim populations. He didn't care about the downtown embassy in Nairobi was at a very busy street. He killed 200 Kenyans in that attack. So, from that point forward, it was clear that he was a serious issue.
So let's go to September 11, 2001. I happened to be in Manhattan, and you had left CNN to write a book about Bin Laden and Al Qaeda. And because of your work, and I obviously at that point knew about Bin Laden, and when I saw the second plane go in, I immediately understood, because of following Peter's work, that the signature of the two things, like the 2 embassy bombings in Tanzania and Kenya, I knew immediately who was responsible. Where were you, and how has your life changed since then?
Well, I was going into CNN on 9/11 because Ahmad Shah Massoud, who was the last man standing between the Taliban and total victory in Afghanistan, had just been assassinated by Al Qaeda. We didn't know that, but we knew that he was dying, and I was going in to talk about it. Because Ahmad Shah Massoud, whose son, by the way, is now leading the resistance to the extent there is any in Afghanistan today. So Ahmad Shah Massoud was assassinated by 2 Al Qaeda operatives posing as journalists, interestingly. The bomb was in the camera. I'm going in and I'm getting towards CNN's DC bureau. And my dad was a pilot, and he pointed out that it was very strange that this plane had just flown into the Trade Center, and then, of course, the second plane happened, and the cab driver I was with, sort of burst into tears. And but I knew that, I knew it was Bin Laden. I just spent years of my life, and I just handed in a book about him a week earlier, which was written in a kind of way as a sort of a travel log, which obviously was completely the wrong tone, and then this enormous disaster had happened. So I went in, and many years later, I looked at what point was I able to get on the air at CNN to say I thought it was Bin Laden, here's why. And it was about 1:30 on September 11th, and I basically said, look, when you have something like this, you have a question of motive and capability. Now, and in fact, President Bush asked the same question to Mike Morrell on the plane at around 10:30 a.m. And Mike Morrell had briefed him that summer about the Bin Laden threat. And
Morrell was a CIA official.
CIA. He became the acting director of CIA. At the time, he was a CIA. He was the briefer. And so George W. Bush asked him, who did this? And he said, well, Iran and Iraq, might have an interest in doing this and certainly capability, but they're not going to do this. I mean, the cost of them would be too much, and it's Osama Bin Laden. Because, this is what I said on the air, which is like motivation and capability. And the answer was it could only be Al Qaeda. And of course, CNN is very careful about this kind of thing. We're not trying to speculate, but it seemed like there was an absence of other potential people who really had the intent and the capability. And Hezbollah might have the capability, but not really the intent. Because obviously you're going to pay a tremendous cost. And Bin Laden made a huge mistake on 9/11, completely misunderstanding the United States. It was like the Japanese and Pearl Harbor, even worse, because Bin Laden's analysis was attack us on 9/11 and we're going to pull out of the Middle East. Well, And he based that us pulling out of Beirut in 1983 after the Marine barracks attack, after pulling out of Somalia after Black Hawk Down. But that was a terrible, a very, very immature and stupid analysis. And of course, we responded. We've never been more involved in the Middle East than we have since then, in our entire history. So, Bin Laden completely misunderstood what was going to happen. We, got rid of the Taliban, put a huge dent in Al Qaeda, and did that very quickly.
I remember you telling me that you had been working on the book. You left CNN to do so. You were basically broke because you'd been working on it, and then things changed. And among other things, you got involved with briefing everybody and writing the book and rewriting the book and so on. But you also consulted on the film Zero Dark 30, which was the popularized film about the hunt for Bin Laden, and you actually wrote a book about what really happened, Manhunt, where you interviewed literally everyone but the president, from the vice president to the head of everything to the actual guys who were the SEAL Team 6 team.
Actually, I then subsequently interviewed President Obama, his only interview in the Situation Room, which was an extraordinary moment for me personally, because you have no time. And when you try to get as much in as possible, and you rehearse it, and 15 minutes here in the situation, 10 minutes here in this corridor, 10 minutes here, and trying to get the president to sort of recount everything that happened. Of course, this is one of the great presidential decisions. It's not Cuban Missile Crisis level because the stakes were so much higher, but it's still something like that, where essentially we pay presidents, him or her, to make decisions with imperfect information, not perfect information. That's why we hire people or vote for the people we think are going to be best. And so Obama, as I'm sure everybody in this room knows, it was 50-50. He had no idea if, So what's very interesting, the people that went in to advise him, they would say there's a 40% chance of Bin Laden being there, or a 60% chance. But when you make the decision, he's either 100% there or 0% there. He's not 40% there. And so, so that's the decision he had to make. And Bob Gates, who started working in Washington in the Lyndon Johnson administration, said no. Robert Gates. Then Vice President Joe Biden, who became a senator when Obama was 12, said no. So, now Hillary Clinton said yes. They go around the table. Most people say some version of yes. There was some people who were in favor of an experimental drone, which hadn't been used in combat, had some potential, possibilities. But he made that decision, and it could have gone. We all know how it came out, but everybody who left the Situation Room that day, the day they made the decision, had visions of Jimmy Carter in their mind. They all knew that a very similar decision had contributed to his one-term presidency.
Back to Zero Dark 30, you had one major problem with the film, which was how they portrayed torture and its relevance. Talk about torture.
Yeah, well, so Mark Bowl, who I'm not a big fan of, is the scriptwriter of this film. And, he's a very talented guy, and Catherine Bigelow is a very talented director. And Bowl asked myself and a couple, John McLaughlin, the former acting director of the CIA, to watch a cut of the film, really too late to make any substantive kind of changes. And, if you've seen Zero Dark 30, the first half an hour is somebody being tortured in a way that the CIA certainly was using coercive interrogation techniques. This was sort of medieval-style torture. And that seemed overblown to me. And then, much more importantly, the story of how Bin Laden was found is not, we just torture this guy, he gives up a name, and then we find Bin Laden. It was an extremely complicated story. It was an Agatha Christie detective novel, with multiple layers of clues and indicators and false starts and false leads. And it wasn't as portrayed in the film, which is not surprising. But Zero Dark 30 tried to have it both ways. It said based on historical events, and then when it was criticized on the facts, they said, well, it's a movie. So you can't have it both ways. And unfortunately, I think it did a real disservice, because what it said to a lot of Americans is that torture led to the Bin Laden, and that therefore torture is. And those filmmakers got a lot of cooperation, by the way, from the agency, from the CIA. I'm not saying these things are directly correlated, but they might be.
To sort of bookend getting the first TV interview with Bin Laden, you were also the only reporter in the world to get into his home, into Abbottabad, where he was killed. Not even any Pakistani reporters got in. Yeah. How did you pull that off, and how mad are your Pakistani journalist friends with the fact that you're the only one who got in?
I have a very persuasive wife, and so we went to Pakistan together to make a film for National Geographic, and my wife had spent a fair amount of time being embedded with the Pakistani military, and we basically said, can you let us on the compound? Pakistan is controlled by its military intelligence agency to a large degree. They controlled the compound. I went 3 times. The third time I said, look, I'm coming back for the third time to ask the same question, so please, just if you don't really want me to go, don't say it's going to happen and then it's not going to happen. And they said, yeah, this time it's really going to happen. So on the third time I went back, they let me on. I didn't know they were going to demolish it. 2 weeks later, they correctly didn't want to have a pilgrimage site, but I think they wanted an independent observer to go in. And for me, it was very useful because it really helped me understand what happened the night of the raid and also how Bin Laden and his family were living.
There's one particularly fantastic detail in the book, what you found in Bin Laden's medicine cabinet.
Was it the natural Viagra? Or was it the Just
for Men?
Just for Men hair dye. Yeah, so both seem interesting. But, Bin Laden had 3 wives, and living with him in the compound, most people, on the run don't take 3 wives and 12 kids and grandkids with him, but he did. And the interesting thing is, the people at the CIA who knew him the best said the fact that he had this very large family with him, to them, the guys, the gentlemen and ladies who had been really following him for years, that to them that was an indicator it was Bin Laden. But so he had 3 wives with him, and we now have all the documents that the SEALs recovered, with the Trump administration released them in full. And one of the kind of surprises, perhaps, is the extent to which Bin Laden relied on his 2 oldest wives, both of whom had PhDs, to do his writing, to do his thinking, to do his strategic, and because you think of Bin Laden as being sort of a misogynist, which in many ways he was. And his views of the world were very close to the Taliban. But he was very reliant on these 2 highly educated wives to write his speeches, to help him think through issues. And so that was the natural Viagra and the Just for Men hair dye, which I do not use.
You don't take hairdressing tips from... No. So, in an interesting way, the title of this program was The Future of Terrorism, and especially how it could impact the U.S. One of the interesting things about your career is, before you thought of interviewing and getting the interview with Bin Laden, you got the first national broadcast interview with a guy named William Pierce, who some of you may know, but William Pierce was essentially the godfather of white nationalism in this country, and the sort of intellectual author of the Oklahoma City bombing. Yeah. So you have an interesting pattern there. But talk about William Pierce and his impact on homegrown terrorism and what we are now dealing with in this country.
Yeah, so William Pierce was a physicist, and he led the American neo-Nazi party. And he wrote a book called The Turner Diaries, which is really the kind of, it's the Bible for white nationalists, violent white nationalists. And so Timothy McVeigh, who blew up the Oklahoma City federal building, killing 168 people, including many children, sold this book at gun shows and went around the country sort of proselytizing. And the book is basically it's not a well-written novel by any means. In fact, Amazon pulled it. You can no after the Capitol insurrection on January 6th, they pulled the book because the plot of the book is relatively simple. It's about a group of white nationalists who decide to attack the federal government, which they describe as the Zionist occupation government, and they attack the Capitol and they attack the FBI, and they do so very violently, and they win, and they install a white nationalist government. Now, this book has been bought by many, many hundreds of thousands of people. It's probably the most influential piece of sort of white nationalist propaganda, and was certainly very influential on Timothy McVeigh.
But also influential with folks like the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers and so on?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, they certainly talk about it, and they frame the a lot of their activities in the same way that William Pierce does in the Turner Diaries, which is, they're going to hang the traitors who are running the government. They're going to have an insurrection. I mean, it's a very similar kind of thing. And as you know, David, because you reported from Oklahoma City, I mean, these ideas are not old ideas, but they kind of keep coming back in various different forms in this country, unfortunately. And one of the things that I work at a place called New America, which is a think tank. We sit around thinking, and one of the things that we look at is the question of, what's a real threat from terrorism today? And we started tracking all terrorist attacks after 9/11, and I can tell you today, the number of lethal terrorist attacks in the United States, so by right-wing terrorists, 122 deaths since 9/11. Number of lethal attacks by jihadist terrorists since 9/11 in the United States, 107. Number of lethal attacks by misogynist incel, ideological misogynists, maybe 17. Black nationalists, 12, far-left terrorists, 1. So the point is right-wing terrorism, and we started doing this research quite a long time ago, and we were very much attacked for underplaying the jihadi terrorist threat. We're not underplaying it, we're just saying what is the real threat. Now, of course, it's basically, I mean, you have Christopher Wray, the head of the FBI, saying right-wing extremist, white nationalist terrorism is the main threat right now, which is, I think, has been true for a long time. But because 9/11 was such a, obviously, completely history, it is one of the hinge events in American history. So that colored, when people talked about terrorism for a long time, it was always, it was seen in the frame of jihadism. Today, I think we know that it can come, and by the way, political violence in this country, there were Puerto Rican nationalists blew up 85 bombs in the 70s. The Weather Underground, the Black Panthers. I mean, we've seen political violence is very much part of the American story, and it doesn't come from just one direction.
What scares you the most right now?
Being interviewed by David Lewis on the stage. No. No, I mean, what scares me, very little scares me, to be honest. I mean, I think that we live, is... I mean, the one thing that I think is worth considering, one of the reasons we can all sit around in this room with some degree of comfort is because of gene editing. So CRISPR was invented by a scientist, Jennifer Doudna, and she in the United States. And I'm not a scientist, so I'm probably going to mangle this, but to the extent that Pfizer and Moderna were able to produce vaccines, effective vaccines almost immediately, it's because of gene editing and the manipulations around mRNA vaccines. Well, that's great, but what about as people start using this potentially for nefarious purposes? Or what about if people start editing out genes they regard as defective in kids? That takes us in a very different direction. And so what I am concerned about is this question, because scientists in the United States, I'm pretty sure will abide by the protocols and the codes that are necessary. But we already have Chinese scientists who don't. And so in the longer term, I am very concerned about unexpected consequences of this technology, because technology is neutral. I mean, railways were great, but they also got people to the battlefields quicker in the Civil War, which is one of the reasons that the Civil War was so lethal. So every technology that comes along is utterly, usually the people in favor of technology say this is great, it's the promised land, the internet's going to make us all be free or whatever, and now, we all know how that vision is in many ways compromised. So that is what I'm concerned about. I think that's a real concern.
This will be my last question, so get your questions ready. You're involved with many things aside from writing books and being a commentator in CNN, VP at New America. You co-direct the Center for the Future of War at Arizona State, but you're also chairman of the board of the Global Special Operations Foundation. I have no clue what that is. Can you tell us?
They asked me to be the chairman, and I was like, you've got the wrong guy. I mean, this really must be some sort of mistake. But it's set up by an old friend of mine who was Admiral McRaven's executive officer, and he's he's a guy called Colonel Stu Braden. He's based in Tampa. And basically what it tries to do, I think rather effectively, and we're seeing very much how this is playing out in Ukraine. Look, why are the Ukrainians winning the war? NATO's been in there since 2014. Who is doing the most effective fighting? The Ukrainian Special Forces. Who is training them? Who has been training them? We have, the United States Special Forces community. So the idea of the foundation is to kind of create a global network of special operators who know each other. So like when a Ukraine comes along, it's not like we suddenly need to find out who everybody is. I mean, we've already been working with them for many, many years. So that's the idea in a nutshell.
All right, so I'm going to go to questions from the audience. Just first, I wanted to say Peter will be signing books outside after this, and there is no meeting next week. I've got to remember to tell you that because it's a national holiday. Okay, questions. RK, there you go.
Peter, thank you for your wonderful speech. Let's give him another round of applause.
Thank you.
Peter, you have so much knowledge about Osama Bin Laden. I talked to many high official people in India. They were certain that Osama Bin Laden is in Pakistan. How far in advance did you know that Obama is in Pakistan near the military base?
Well, I mean, I'm going to try and answer that question in the following way, which is, did the Pakistanis know Bin Laden was in Abbottabad, living next door to their equivalent of West Point? And the short answer is no, they didn't. I talked to dozens of people involved in the decision making. They all said Pakistan didn't know. In fact, one of the big debates was, should we get the Pakistanis involved in this operation? And everybody said no, because the information might leak. At that time, our relations with the Pakistanis were the worst they've ever been. The drone program was at its height. Raymond Davis was an American CIA contractor who killed 2 Pakistanis. He was in jail. So our relations with the Pakistanis were really bad. We had no reason to kind of, every American official I spoke to said the Pakistanis did not know Bin Laden was there. And in fact, now we have documents from the compound in Abbottabad, which show that there was considerable hostility between Al-Qaeda and the Pakistani government. So there's never been any evidence showing that they knew that Bin Laden was there. Bin Laden was hiding from people in his own house. So the bodyguards had their own families, and some of the bodyguards' one of the bodyguards' wives didn't know it was Osama Bin Laden who was living there. And so he was being very careful.
Taya.
I think it's pretty minimal. That doesn't mean it doesn't come back. I mean, if you look at the Taliban today, I was a huge skeptic of the Trump peace plan that Biden went along with because I spent time in Taliban-controlled Afghanistan. We make a huge mistake, we Americans, about mirror imaging, which is we assume that everybody else is just going to have exactly the same idea about the world that we are once they behave rationally. Well, no. And in fact, the Taliban are a bunch of ideologues who've spent 20 years fighting for something, and they're not going to set up a quasi-democracy when they get into power the second time. The Minister of the Interior of the Taliban is on the Leadership Council of Al-Qaeda. So we've, for the first time in history, a member of Al-Qaeda is a cabinet member, to the extent that you can call the Taliban cabinet a real cabinet.
That's Haqqani?
It's Haqqani, Siraj Haqqani, who, by the way, has kidnapped a bunch of Americans over the years. Most recently, Mark Frericks, who just got released, who has been held for 2 years. So, right now, I don't see a real threat from Al-Qaeda. But, give it 5 years, and, luckily we're protected by the Pacific Ocean and the Atlantic Ocean. But, it's much easier for some of the, jihadists in Europe to travel there. You can imagine something similar to what happened with ISIS in Syria, where Europeans start going and getting training, and then attacks in Europe or attacks against American targets in the region. But nonetheless, right now the threat, certainly to the United States, is pretty low. Our problem, we talk about homegrown terrorism. What's interesting is jihadist terrorism is all homegrown now. It's very hard to get in the country if you're a jihadist, but it's not hard to get in if you're already here. So Omar, the guy who killed 49 people at the Orlando nightclub, was a second-generation American who was born in Queens, New York, Omar Mateen. So, I mean, what the real concern we should have is not necessarily Al-Qaeda planning some attack from over there, but inspiring attacks here with people who are like like-minded, just as ISIS did when it controlled big chunks of territory in Syria and Iraq. But overall, I think we've done a pretty good job of managing this threat. We're never going to defeat them entirely, but we certainly managed it. You can't say it's hard to say as a politician we've largely managed this, but I think that's kind of where we are, because if you say we've largely managed this and then something happens, there's a lot of political costs. But the fact is both the Republican and Democrat administrations have done a pretty good job of managing this. I think Joe Biden made a huge unforced error by just pulling out of Afghanistan. It's like, why? There was no constituency for this. It's not like there were people in the Democratic Party saying, you have to do this. People had a lightly held view that we should get out, but it wasn't like we need to get out. And of course, look at his popularity ratings. They went to 46%. They never recovered from this. And now, of course, there are other reasons for it, but it was sort of it wasn't just incompetently done. I think it was a bad policy decision. And it was made against the advice of General Milley and many others who publicly testified. We said, leave 2,500 troops. By the way, there are 2 million members of the armed services in this country, National Guard, active duty. 2,500 is not a big commitment. And we had 2,500 troops there. The 34 provinces in Afghanistan, none of the provincial cities were controlled by the Taliban when we had 2,500 troops. We have 25,000 troops still in South Korea. South Korea is one of the poorest countries in the world after the Korean War, now one of the richest. So to me, it's a mystifying decision that may come, unfortunately, and come back to haunt us.
Well, and certainly, Ayman al-Zawahiri, the head of Al-Qaeda, felt comfortable enough to move back to Kabul, as an example, although it didn't work out for him. Next question. Where are we here? Okay.
Thank you. So you talked about the future of potential terrorism and talked about the gene editing technology. Yeah. One of the things that's happened in the post 9/11 world is also we're no longer at war with countries that we can put sanctions on, things like that. There are smaller groups that we're fighting against, like Al-Qaeda and ISIS and stuff. As technology gets more democratized and more sophisticated, what are the odds of a small group of people coming up with a cyber attack, or even a rogue government coming up with a cyber attack to destabilize or disable the United States?
Yeah, well, there's a Moore's law here, so at play. So obviously, there's a democratization of the ability to do damage through these technologies. But I think terrorist groups are not at that point, because terrorist groups, they want to kill people. Typically that you do that with a bomb or a weapon. Carrying out a cyber attack that would actually either cause substantial financial damage or death. This is not, terrorist groups do not have that capacity right now, and I don't see it in the foreseeable future. Countries like Iran, countries like Russia, countries like China, yes, they do, and maybe their proxies could. But for the moment, we have not seen, people at one point talked about a cyber 9/11. I just don't see that happening, because we're not at that point yet, and maybe 15, 20 years down the road, if there was like some vast acceleration in technology, it's possible. But right now, I don't think it's really terrorist groups can be cyber nuisances. They can deface the Pentagon webpage, but they can't carry out an attack which would result in the loss of life or substantial financial damage.
Okay, last question, Sam.
Talk about what turned Bin Laden. His family was one of the wealthiest families in Saudi Arabia. I remember working with Portman that Bin Laden Construction Company was building military bases for the U.S. Corps of Engineers.
Yeah. Something
happened, and why?
That is such a good question. I have a book that tries to answer it just out there that you can... But, it actually gets to the nature of evil, which is a big question. I can tell you a lot of things about what got him there, but I can't give you the complete answer because it's not answerable. And I think about the Sanyas who killed the small boy attending the Boston Marathon. If you have the Sanya brother who's here on stage and he was, why did you do that? He would say something about American foreign policy. But it would be very unsophisticated. So at the end of the day, it's like, why do you kill innocent civilians who are strangers to you? Is that this is a pretty deep question. There's no really good answer to that. And Bin Laden has 54 siblings, half siblings. None of them went down this path. So I think at the end of this is hopefully not a cop out, but I think it's ultimately not an answerable question.
Thank you. Books for sale outside. No meeting next week.